But the courthouse has changed in a few profound ways. It just took people to make the changes happen. The change came from within.
I did most of my work was, I sort of stayed in the background. I did a lot of the research, a lot of the pleadings. I went in the courtroom with Mr. Anderson. I assisted him, but he did the actual trial work.
And across the street where all the news and the men went was the In-N-Out service station.
During that period of time, after I came back, he was Solicitor General or District Attorney of the circuit for about 8 years. So I had widespread contact in the 4 counties by reason of being associated with him in that work.
And when I went to work, right next door to that was Mr. Zetrau, and Dr. Hooks, who was a veterinarian. They had some mules of things in there at that time.
But Mildred would eventually move that office, and this move would symbolize some of the profound effects Highway 301 played on the downtown district when it was a main thoroughfare to Florida.
You're talking about a business. I had a telegraph business on 301. Yes, sir.
This is US 301. Before Interstate 95 and 16, this was the main thoroughfare.
And I was the only office left open on 301 for a small town. I worked hard to keep this office open.
18-wheelers were as common in downtown Statesboro during the reign of Highway 301 as they now are on Interstate 95 or I-16. And with all the traffic generated by the highway through town, business picked up for Main Street. As a matter of fact, more business came to downtown Statesboro than anyone could have imagined.
During my tenure as a practice of law and then early on into being a judge, there was accidents after collisions, deaths, mutilations, people injured in these, and that was work for lawyers. It really boosted the law practice here in the rural areas because we had all these lawsuits growing out of injuries, deaths, insurance claims, and that was really the backbone of the rural areas of the state of Georgia for lawyers during that period of time.
After industry and trade evolved, main streets would remain the centerpieces of towns all across the country for many years to come. And since the evolution is ever-changing with main streets, eras of dominance for businesses in downtown districts do come to an end. And the widest variety of memories exists and persists in the hearts and minds of those who saw each era come to an end.
You know, when you come into Statesboro, you go 4 different ways. Okay, there were a block. Those things were a block, and that was Statesboro. When you got out of that, you were in somebody's cotton field.
We have what's called Old Port, where they had a post office, a mercantile store, and that's where they generated out doing the pine.
We went to the movies and registered. It was a lively little town.
Stilson only had just a couple of little small general stores that sold groceries.
Sea Island parking lot, back in there was a big, and that was an armory back there where they had the National Guards and they had a skating ring in there.
In those days, that was the central location for farmers and people living within a radius of 10 miles or 5 miles of Brooklet. It was the center at that time of that little area encompassing the area around Brooklet. So there was no need for us to have to come to Statesboro because we could get everything we needed in Brooklet.
Portal at one time was a really busy little town. We had a lot of stores that were busy, especially on Saturday night. Everybody had benches out on the front of the stores. People would sit down and visit. And I know that my uncle had a service station there where the Time Saver is now. And we'd go up on Saturday night and sit on the bench, and we'd visit with people as they were passing, and all. That was our social life.
But as separate as it seems, they were from each other. They really were interconnected and dependent on one another.
Saturdays was the day the farmers went to town with their families.
So this was where we shopped during the week. And on Saturday we went to Statesboro, to town, to shop.
It was all really one great big family of people.
Everybody came to town on Saturday. You dressed up and you went to town and you parked south, east, and west.
And while the main streets of Bulloch County were, and are, the centerpieces of their respective cities, towns, and districts, there were outlying communities too, and West Side was one of the biggest.
We lived out there. That's where I was born and raised, out West Side Road.
The West Side community was a populated area with farms, schools, and families sprawled across the countryside, from Fish Trap to the front end of Banks Dairy.
My grandmother's daddy had a post office in his house because at that time rural mail delivery had not started. So people had post offices in their homes and the neighbors would go get their mail there.
The West Side community supplied some of the best farmland in Bulloch County to those wanting to tend crops.
Living on the farm was the beauty of the crops and seeing the white cotton in the fields and the open spaces. It was just so pretty, all the seasons to be out on the farm. So I would just love this area because the fields were big and you could see it for a long distance.
West Side is actually over there on West Side. My grandfather, who I was telling you about, was a doctor. That is where he grew up.
You know where Bethlehem Church is? And just before you get to Bethlehem, there's a road turns off up this way. That's where my mother came from.
The wonderful people that lived in this community, we all just were close and loved each other and would do anything for each other. I remember how we helped each other.
If one had a biscuit, the other had half. And it was just that. And I think that's one of the greatest things I've ever heard of, is people being willing to share. And if they need something, somebody being willing to help. I think that's the greatest thing.
This is what we call the little country store when I was growing up during the war years. And this was a real treat to come to the little store and get candy bars for 5 cents, a lot of penny candy. Got my first bubble gum here and learned to blow my first bubbles.
There's little stores scattered everywhere, kind of like that. Even farmers that had a lot of hands and everything, they would have a commissary so that they could sell to their workers.
Back in those days, they didn't have the Coke machines that they had later days, so they had these like huge blocks of ice they would put in a metal box that had legs, and the Cokes would freeze, and that was the most delicious drink.
They made ice night and day. I guess you can remember hearing the clatter of the tanks and everything. And my husband's job was that he would deliver to these little commissaries along. And they had to wrap it up in burlap or something like that to keep it from melting. And they'd have an ice pick and they'd cut off chunks and sell it to the commissaries like that.
You didn't have a refrigerator and freezers and all. They delivered the groceries to your house.
And while they all didn't live in downtown Statesboro, they all certainly remember what it meant to go to downtown Statesboro as children.
When we went to town, we went with Daddy with his mule and wagon, and we all sat in the back of the wagon, hung our feet out, and went to town.
I had some girlfriends that their mothers loved to go to town and park in front of Ellis drugstore and watch the people.
Minkovitz, the largest department store, it had 3 floors.
Minkovitz was going real strong at that time, that's when I was growing up too.
And at Christmas time, the Toyland was on the 3rd floor, and my mother would take my sister and I to pick out what we wanted for Christmas, and that was a big treat.
Yeah, I worked at that old Milkovitz downtown for a while.
And then we'd go to the Western Auto store to look at the wheel toys there. So that was a big treat to go at Christmas time.